And I will now turn the floor over to Isaiah and to Kate.
I just want
Perfect.
just one I just so one thing, Isaiah, before you kick in. Just to let you know, Blackstone Valley Veggie Gardens has several presentations, and not a few of them we have that are actually remote. Matter of fact, Wednesday, I have one on the life cycle of seeds. Very interesting. And that's one in, I believe, North Andover, but it's a Zoom one. So Blackstone Valley Veggie Gardens.com is the website.
Okay.
And we have upcoming events, so you can follow us. And, we may have one in your area. If not, we have plenty of virtual ones and 23 different ones in the portfolio. So I hope to see you all again. That's all. That's my spiel. I'll hand it over to Isaiah because, like you, I'm not a mycologist either. So.
Well, thank you guys so much. Super excited to be here, and if you guys enjoy today's presentation, so I'll just go ahead and jump into things. Feel free to turn your screen on if you want, but no worries if not. And I will get into introduction shortly. Perfect. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me today again. I'm super excited to have everyone here. Mushrooms are what I do for a living. It's what I do in my spare time. It's what I love, and it's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. So welcome to my passion and my love. And thank you so much for joining me and listening to me ramble on for a little bit. So who am I? My name is Isaiah Chavez. My formal engineering background is in environmental engineering over at Colorado State University. I got that recently. I've got 2 little ferrets that cause lots of havoc in my life. And I'm the lead mycologist over at Mystic Mountain Mushrooms and also a part owner. And basically we just do mushroom production. So things like oyster mushrooms, lion's mane, reishi, all the mushrooms you can think of. We do about 1,000 pounds a week. We're scaling up to do about 3,000 pretty soon here. So real excited about that. I'm also the lead engineer over at the Colorado Mycological Watershed Institute. And basically we do bioremediation with fungi. So there's something like a forest fire or an oil spill or some catastrophic environmental situation that occurs, we come in and inoculate the soil or the land or the trees or whatever it might be with specific fungi to try to bioremediate these plots of land. I'm also the owner of mushroommentorship.org, which is my website and my company. And it's essentially a fungal consulting company that does different fungal consultants. So if you're wanting to build a jar or like a farm, a lab, anything in relation to mushrooms, we'll do that for you. Also R&D and product development along with SOPs and things like that. So I also teach classes, and so I stay pretty busy for all the time. But yeah, that's my life currently. It's a little bit chaotic, but I absolutely love it. And you can see a picture of my little fairy in the top right.
Okay, I'm on this Zoom call.
Okay.
We'll see.
I think your microphone might be on, Nancy.
Oh, sorry.
No worries. So I like to start things out with what mushrooms actually are, because oftentimes we see this thing popping out of the ground, and usually it's where plants are or in forests. And so a lot of times we think it's a plant. A lot of times we're not sure what it actually is, right? We just know it's a mushroom. They're funky, right? And they're strange. And that's the best way a lot of people would describe them. What mushrooms actually are is simply the fruit of the mycelium. And what that means is they're a small part of a much larger organism. So this small organism is really the small piece of the organism that you're seeing is the mushroom. And that mushroom makes up 5% of the total 100% mass, right? So 95% of that biomass lives underground of the total organism. So the organism's majority underground. And what the organism actually is it's called mycelium. And it's this white spider web-like network that the mushroom grows from. Well, I like to kind of use this analogy in which we think of the mushroom as the apple in this case, and the mycelium is the apple tree. We would never call an apple tree an apple, right? And we would never call an apple tree. An apple comes from an apple tree. Well, it's the exact same thing with mycelium. Mycelium produces a mushroom, right? It's not vice versa. The mushroom doesn't produce the mycelium. It's the mycelium producing the mushroom. And what that is a fruiting body. So just like in fruits, it has seeds. Well, in mushrooms, we have spores, and there's trillions and trillions of spores released every day by mushrooms, individual mushrooms. It's also important to consider that these aren't plants whatsoever. They're completely different than plants. And that's because they breathe air just like we do and actually breathe out CO2. So instead of like being like plants that breathe in CO2 and breathe out air, they're going to do the complete opposite. They're also going to break things down for their energy, right? So they need to actively eat things. They're not autotrophs, right? An autotroph is going to be a plant, and that's going to be something that just absorbs sunlight. It gets free energy, and that free energy it converts into sugar. Well, that's what photosynthesis is. Mushrooms can't photosynthesize. In fact, the thing that they can do is weirdly enough, they can convert sunlight into vitamin D just like we can with our melanin. And so certain mushrooms have melanin, certain button mushrooms and agaricus species have melanin, and they're able to convert this vitamin or this UV sunlight and this UV energy into vitamin D, just like we do. They also are more closely related to us than they are to plants. And so kind of think of us in mushrooms as being these two things that split off a long time ago. And plants are way out here, right? This is us, this is the mushrooms, these are the plants way out here. And they're not really that far apart, but they are very different than each other comparative to us and mushrooms. Us and mushrooms came from a common ancestor, which means that a long, long time ago, when we were weird little blobs, we essentially split off from this similar ancestor and went on our journey to becoming the animal kingdom, whereas the mushrooms went on to create the fungal kingdom. And so the fungal kingdom as a whole is made up of fungi, and there's 5 different kingdoms, arguably. It gets kind of complicated, and we generally just keep it at 5 right now in terms of what's agreed upon. And so that's the Monera, protozoa, plants, animals, and fungi, and you can jump around a little bit in terms of how you say those, but really the most important one today that we're looking at is the fungi. And so what is fungi? Well, fungi is an organism that produces spores. Spores are just like these tiny, tiny little seeds that germinate and form mycelium. Mycelium is, we'll get into what that is exactly in the next slide, but mycelium often makes up these organisms, and they consist of things like molds, yeast, mushrooms, toadstools. Anything you see, it's kind of funky. Even slime molds get considered to be a fungi often, but in reality, they're actually not a fungi. So just a little fun fact. But it's also important to consider that all mushrooms are fungi, but not all fungi are mushrooms. And so what that means is that not all fungi are going to produce fruiting bodies. So out of the 100,000 or so fungi that we currently know about, so we've only discovered about 100,000, give or take. Of that, only 10% of that is actually going to be mushrooms or fungi that produce mushrooms. So about 10,000 species we know of produce mushrooms. So it's really not that much, but it's a ton. So realistically, there could be 100,000 mushrooms out there. On the higher end of the estimates, it could be closer to 300,000 mushroom species. And that would be up to 3 million different fungi species that we haven't discovered yet, which is incredible, given that a third of the Earth's biomass, which is the living parts of Earth, are made up of fungi. So a third of the Earth, of this biomass, right? We've only discovered 2 to 5% of the total species of that whole third of the Earth, which is incredible. And they're incredibly genetically diverse. So the potential for these things is amazing in terms of biotechnology, engineering, bioremediation, food sciences, medicine, biopharmaceuticals, material sciences. Just the list goes on and on and on, because these are ancient organisms that have existed and dominated for the longest time. So what is mycelium? Well, mycelium is this white spider web that spreads out underground. I like to call it these tiny reaching little hands because they kind of are. They're these little tiny tubes that reach out underground and reach out and pierce through the ground. And as they do this, they're essentially degrading the ground and breaking it down. Now, this can stretch on for miles and miles and miles. Now, the mycelium is made up of individual tubes. So one tube will form, and then that from the very tip will split off into two tubes, right? Kind of like that. And it just keeps going and forming this gigantic network. And these tubes just keep splitting off from each other, and they're hollow on the inside. Well, I like to call them these inside out stomachs. And that's because much like us, mushrooms have to consume something, right? They have to eat and break it down to get their energy. So we have to eat, ingest, and digest. Well, they just do it the exact opposite. They actually digest first and ingest second. So they secrete these digestive enzymes around these hyphal walls or these tubes. And these digestive enzymes reach out and basically break down all the things around them. As they're reaching through the soil, they're testing the soil for, okay, what is this compound made of? What is this soil made of? Do I have to produce around me to break down this soil? So they're a bit like supercomputers in that way. They're constantly calculating new ways to break down what's in front of them. Because you have to imagine, they don't come pre-built in that way. Not every compound on Earth wasn't programmed into mycelium, right? It wasn't like, okay, we're going to tell them how to break down this pollutant and this pollutant and this wood, right from the start, because most of these things are new to them. And so what happens is they learn on the go how to break down these things. And so they are reaching through the ground, learning how to break down new things, producing these enzymes around them that break down the things surrounding them. And then that goes back down in liquid form back towards these tubes. These tubes are the stomach, essentially. They're the inside out stomach. So it's the stomach wall, basically on the outside. And the liquid goes and hits the stomach wall, and through active cell wall absorption, the liquids and nutrients are absorbed through the mycelium. And then they move this liquid throughout the network, right? And they're able to do it in extremely complex ways that we still fundamentally do not understand. So they do these incredible things, and they move the nutrients around and make sure the rest of the organism has sufficient amounts of liquid and nutrients, and they do all kinds of insane things. I could go on for years, but really the largest living organism on Earth is going to be a patch of mycelium. So it's a honey mushroom mass living in Oregon. A honey mushroom is actually a parasitic mushroom, and so it's a parasitic fungi that is so large that it would take me personally about 45 minutes to walk across it. So it just gives you a size, an estimate of how large this thing is. It is incredibly large. And that's just the top portion, the X direction. I mean, the Y direction, I forget how deep it goes, but it's incredible. And it's over 2,000 years old, I think. So just this incredibly old being that is incredibly intelligent, and that it's figured out how to break down a variety of things and parasitize an entire forest. And it's made its home, this forest in Oregon. And so someday I'd really like to go there myself, but I have yet to make the trip. Maybe soon. But yeah, mycelium is just this incredible organism that has incredible potential. And so what do mushrooms actually do? I keep talking about their potential and why they're so important. Well, I really haven't gotten into why, but that's what this slide's for. Really, what they do is they decompose things. They break things down around us. And that seems like a pretty simple job, but really it's not. It's incredibly complex. For everything around us to break down into its simple particles, we're taking apart these complex machines into their machinery and pieces, their nuts and bolts. To do that, you've got to be a really, really good engineer. And that's what mushrooms are. They're the engineers of the world. They take things apart and they put them back together. Well, that's important because if we didn't have that function, if we didn't have that ability to take things apart, to break them down and put them back together, well, then we wouldn't have the world that we have today. A long time ago, during a period called the Carboniferous period, trees fell and fell and fell, and plants would grow and grow and grow, and they would never die. I mean, they would die, but they wouldn't die due to natural causes like a fungi attacking them or pests attacking them. No, they died from natural age, and that was because they developed this shell that we call bark. It's also known as lignin, and lignin is this extremely large, complex carbon molecule. And with this large, complex carbon molecule, we have to essentially look at it and say, how are we going to break this down? Well, most organisms weren't able to figure it out. They couldn't crack the code. So trees and plants grew for a long time unchecked. And due to that, they stacked just, for incredible heights into the air. And you can imagine, how terrifying this must have been as a sight. Well, eventually fungi figured out how to break down this lignin, and that's one of the theories. There's other theories around how the Carboniferous period accumulated its carbon load, but one of the theories is that the fungi hadn't figured out how to break down the lignin. Well, white rot fungi exist today, so we know that lignin degrading fungi exist, and so these lignin degrading fungi eventually got the ability to break down lignin. And we see that because theoretically the coat layer ends right where the fungi began to break down the trees. Because all that wood that stacked up got compressed down into coal. And that's what turned into our coal that we utilize today. If it wasn't for coal, we wouldn't have petroleum, and that we wouldn't have been able to build our petroleum reliance, right? Energy kind of stacks into one another, in that, coal would build into petroleum, and petroleum theoretically could build into nuclear alternatives. And nuclear is an alternative energy source, and it's actually the cleanest energy source. It's just rather misunderstood. But that was a bit of a tangent. But they're incredibly important to our ecosystem due to that. If nothing were to break down, we would have literal bodies just stacked up into the sky, and it would be horrifying. So try not to think about that because it's a terrifying sight. But we break these down into two groups. Thankfully, we do have mushrooms, and they do this job for us, right? We have the primary and secondary decomposers. Primary decomposers are going to be the guys that break down wood and leaf litter. So when the trees come down and the leaves fall, these are the guys that break that down initially. Well, they break down that lignin, eat some of that hemicellulose and cellulose. That's that wood, that's that white part, right? And then the secondary come in once it's in that composty kind of lots of stuff is pooped on it form. And there's lots of microorganisms living in this, and it's a lot more broken down. They take this secondary this secondary compost essentially, and they turn it into what's called humus. Humus is essentially the final form of soil, if you will. It's what happens when soil breaks down in something where nothing else wants to eat it, right? There's no more nutrition left that's feasible to pull out of it. Theoretically could, but you can't generally you just don't with humus. There's other food sources around you. And the science of that gets a little complex, but really why we need humus is because if plants couldn't grow in that topsoil layer, right, if they couldn't establish their roots in the topsoil, well, they wouldn't be able to grow, right? And the topsoil is important because it's not constantly degrading. Things are able to live inside of the topsoil without it breaking down. It's like if the floor underneath us just constantly kept falling, well, we wouldn't be able to establish our lives, right? So we need the floor for us not to fall, and for that to happen, the topsoil has to exist. And so that's why mushrooms are incredibly important in the cycle where they go from trees and organic matter that's been carbon captured into this form that's a second kind of broken down form that's in between, compost and this, living tree form. And then they take that into compost and compost into humus. And that doesn't go any further generally. So then we get into the mushroom life cycle, how exactly this functions. So it starts all by a mushroom, right? So the mushroom drops its spores, and these spores float off and find the correct conditions. When I speak about conditions, I mean things like humidity, temperature, things like airflow, the food that it can taste around it. Spores have certain chemical triggers. And the spore is going to germinate and form a hyphae, a single tube, and that tube is going to split off into two into four, and yada, 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 exponential into billions and trillions of little hyphal threads. These threads are so dense that within 1 square inch of healthy soil, if we take that from the ground, there's 8 miles of mycelium living in there, mycelial threading. And so this hyphae is asexual at this point in its life once it germinates and forms a hyphae. So what that means is it can't form a mushroom yet. This single spore can't form a mushroom on its own. So what it has to do is it reaches out through the soil in search of a partner. It's looking for a lover, essentially. And some of these mushrooms have up to 23,000 different genders. The genetic diversity is absolutely incredible. And so it's reaching out through the soil, looking for a partner, searching, testing different mycelium, saying, hey, are you compatible? Sending chemical signals back and forth. Finally, eventually, it meets something compatible with it, and they start to meet and they start to intertwine with each other. And it's actually pretty beautiful. And that these two networks start to intertwine and mingle, and these threads start to grow together into this beautiful network, right? And then they clamp together and they physically become one living organism. It's the ultimate sacrifice for love, in my opinion, is this essentially giving yourself to a partnership in such a way that you become one, right? And then you do that to produce a child or a mushroom in their case that goes on to spread your spores or spread your offspring. And so really it's kind of a poetic thing in the way that they do it. And some mushrooms even are asexual, so they kind of clone themselves, which is really interesting. Some mushrooms, like ascomycetes, actually, and not all ascomycetes, but some don't form clamp connections. And what that means is they intertwine with each other and form these beautiful networks as two living organisms and live their entire life as two living organisms, but they live it together. So it takes it a step beyond just becoming one organism. They live as two organisms with the same goal in mind, with the same intentions in mind, agreeing on every step, agreeing on every length of thread that's being built. It's incredible. And then they go ahead and produce a mushroom that produces spores that have a new set of DNA. The combination of these two hyphal nets, these two mycelial networks, primary, boom, that makes a secondary mycelial network. That produces a mushroom, and that mushroom shoots its spores out and starts the cycle over again. And that's exactly how mushrooms function in nature. For the most part, it gets super, super funky in some cases. Fungi are insane when it comes to their biology and the way that they interact with the environment. There are certain fungi that have 10,000 different nuclei, and those are kind of like the brains of our cells. And that fundamentally is not feasible, but it is for these fungi because they essentially choose what brain is in charge. They're called a glomeromycota. And these different brains function at different times depending on the outside conditions, and they can actually absorb the nuclei of other organisms that aren't even related to them, like bacteria utilize them. So super funky. Some people argue that it should be its sixth kingdom called the shapeshifter kingdom. Well, something much fancier than that, but and snobbier, but you know how science is. But mushrooms are funky. That is one thing that you should pull from this, that they are super weird. And because of that, there's so much potential, so much. And then I like to go over the basic anatomy of a cap and stem mushroom. So you have the cap, and that's going to protect your gills. And the gills are where your spores form and your spores drop from. Then you have what's called a skirt. A skirt essentially grows underneath the mushroom, right on the underside of its cap. As the mushroom grows and gets more and more concave, flatter, or less and less concave, flatter, that veil eventually breaks and the spores drop. And that's what protects the veil, or protects the gills from damage as it's growing out of the ground early. There's also the stem, or the steep, and that generally just holds up the cap, which is connected to the gills. And then we have the vulva, which is remnants of the kind of what we call the primordia or hyphal knot, and that's like a baby mushroom. And then we have the most important part, which is the mycelium. Now, embarrassingly enough, I forgot to introduce probably the most important part of why I'm so obsessed with mushrooms when I was talking about myself. And so I'm going to jump into that real quick before I jump into the next slide, because it's important to know why I'm so obsessed with mushrooms, because it's pretty out there. I know, because I really, really like mushrooms, obviously. And And to like mushrooms this much, you've either got to, take a lot of them, the fun kind, or you've got to have had, some kind of experience with them. And the experience I had with mushrooms was a few years ago. I was 20 at the time, just about to turn 21, going through school, getting my degree, and I was putting my TV up at the time, I remember, and out of nowhere, I just had a seizure. And it was the first time in my life that that had ever happened to me. Um, when I woke up, I was on the ground and I kind of came to, and I realized that my whole body was like shaking, like I was twitching, all my muscles were moving and I couldn't control them. And then I realized I couldn't feel my legs anymore or move my legs at all. And yeah, I pretty much crawled downstairs and was like, hey, called out to my roommate. And I was like, I think there's something wrong with me. And we go to the hospital, and long story short, about 6 months of testing later, all the brain scans and radiation injections and crazy stuff like that, they tell me that they can't find anything that's physically wrong with me, in terms of a physical structure that's broken, which means that it goes beyond their scope at that current point. So they could treat me for the symptoms, and treat me for, the stuff I was dealing with on the side, but they couldn't actually fix me, right? There's nothing they could physically fix. So it was a couple months of just being pretty depressed. And then I started going kind of crazy with the self-experimentation and research into neuroscience, and built a little lab upstairs with me. And I would, crawl downstairs and order stuff off Amazon. And I would, get these boxes and cut holes through them and tie them to my legs and pull myself up by the banisters until I got to the top of the stairs. And that's how I built my lab. It was quite the process. So got it done. And, I can't tell you how annoying it is to work with Petri dishes, like this, and your hand is just shaking like this. I'd throw 10 of them across the room for every one that I would get. But I got those ones, and that's all that mattered. And I eventually started culturing out fungal cultures that I wanted to experiment on myself with, and breeding those together, and ended up with a strain that was pretty effective, that seemingly. And so I macrodosed myself one day, and increasing dosages, I doubled it and increased it by 0.5 for 3 days. And I combined that with some gabapentin, which is an anticonvulsant, and an acid to help break down the cell walls and increase the dephosphorylation and psilocin conversion. And so after doing all of that, on the third day, I'm sitting on the floor, and it hadn't worked, which was pretty much a bummer. And I was like, on to the next. And as I thought that, all of a sudden I realized that I wasn't moving anymore, and I would constantly move. That was part of my condition. I still have little twitches here and there, and I lose, my neck just cricked right there, but like for just tiny little things. But before, my whole body would just shake violently, and it stopped. And it was like, holy, just a moment of peace. And I'm like freaking out inside, because I'm like, no way this just worked. Like, that's not how things work in life. Like, this is not a movie. Isaiah, you did not mad scientist yourself back to health. Like, this isn't real. And then I'm like really freaking out, because I'm like, what if I excite myself too much that I like re-twitch myself out? So I sat there for like 5 minutes just waiting for it to come back. I always tell people I felt like a deer, waiting for this wolf to jump on me, just this prey animal waiting for this predator to jump on you. And it didn't. It just didn't ever start again. And I got so excited that I jumped up, and I realized that I was using my legs again. And from that day on, I dedicated my life to mushrooms. And I called my mom and dad crying, telling them, I'd fixed myself. And they were pretty confused, because I really hadn't been telling them about this self-experimentation. But when I told them it was mushrooms, they were like, Isaiah, you're hallucinating, like you can't walk. And I'm like, no guys, really, like I know I'm hallucinating, but I can also walk. Like, and so it was a trip, literally. But yeah, they saved my life from that day on. I dedicated my life to mushrooms and the study of fungi, and that's what I do now. And so that's why I love it so much, and that's why I believe there's so much potential in it. especially in the world of medicine, but also in the world of bioremediation, because that's what my formal background is in, environmental engineering and bioremediation. So it's a nice intersection, but yeah, thank you guys so much again for coming. I'm going to jump back into the fun stuff. So thank you. Now, I know that was kind of heavy, so we'll do something a little lighter, like categories of mushrooms. So we have 4 different categories of mushrooms: saprotrophic, mycorrhizal, parasitic, and endophytic. And these are the 4 ways that they consume their food or their prey. Saprotrophic are only going to feed on dead things. So they're only going to eat things like dead wood or leaf litter or compost, for example, like the primary and secondary decomposers. They're not going to eat something living. Whereas the mycorrhizal mushroom is going to work with something living. They actually have a partnership with plants where they connect together. Those hyphal tips reach through the soil, pierce the plant roots, and form this little communication hub. In this communication hub, they start to talk to each other and say, hey, mushroom's like, I've got a bunch of nitrogen, a bunch of phosphorus, and a bunch of water. What do you have to offer? Plant's like, well, I get free energy from the sun, so I can create sugar all the time for you. And they start to trade those 2 things. And that's fundamentally how nature works. 95% of plants on Earth wouldn't exist without this mycorrhizal connection. So 95% of plants on Earth would die immediately tomorrow if we took away fungi. Beyond that, there's also this thing called the endophytic fungi that actually lives in the plant cells itself. We think that for every plant, there's at least 8 to 9 fungal species that live on the plant. That's just on the surface of the plant, not connected to the inside of the plant's roots, right? So there's an incredible amount of fungal species that live within and outside of plants to keep them alive. Plants are essentially, they've been babied by mushrooms to come out of the ocean. And a long time ago, mushrooms took them out of the ocean. They kind of led the path, led the charge, and then built these giant structures that we called early, I'm forgetting the name, Taxomycetes or something close to that. I think it's gonna bother me, but yeah, it's I think it's taxa something. And they were these giant structures of plants and plants and fungi that were kind of like lichens. Now, these endophytic fungi live within the plant cells, and they do things like preventing pests from attacking plants by producing toxins to protect the plants. They'll increase their drought tolerance. They will increase how strong the plants are, their rigidity, do all kinds of crazy stuff like that for the plants, because the plants feed the endophytic fungi. They're 100% solely responsible for feeding the fungi. If the plants don't feed the fungi die. They're like pets, but they're not pets. They're like I don't know, like children, I guess, infants maybe. But they don't have the ability to feed themselves. They can just do really cool stuff for you. So it's like this cool little beneficial thing that lives inside of your cells that you feed occasionally, and it does beneficial things for you. So we're trying to learn how to genetically engineer these so that we could just spray them on plants, and all of a sudden the plant's 50% more water retentive. Or we spray it on a plant and suddenly it's resistant against these pests. All of these natural non-chemical ways to protect plants and increase their yields. We're trying to figure it out with endophytic fungi. It's just incredibly hard because they don't grow on petri dishes. They only grow in plant cells. So you have to grow them on a plant cell, which is really hard. I'm trying to do it, but I have a few different labs, but I mainly work out of the one in my house still in my free time for fun, and that's a fun project. So it's difficult to do in these settings, but at some point I definitely want to increase my endophytic projects. Then we also have the parasitic mushroom. The parasitic mushroom actually comes in and attacks their host plant, and they just kill it and eat it. And there's no benefits to the host plant. Now, the benefits of this existing is they act as a filter. So they actually essentially kill the dying or sick trees and plants and other fungi in the environment and make space for the new life to come in by creating compost right there where that old tree was. Well, from that old tree grows a new sapling, and that's how the life cycle continues. Otherwise, we'd have trees that take 20 years to die, take up an incredible amount of space. Suddenly we have a whole forest full of dying trees. They all die at the same time or near the same time. It has an incredible forest fire. the entire forest dies. We don't want that. So parasitic fungi act as a filter to protect us from that. And saprotrophic fungi go and eat that wood to make sure that it doesn't build up, burn forever. Now, I like to cover how to identify mushrooms. So if you ever see them when you're walking around, you will be able to. So time frame of harvest is a great one. Is it the right season for the mushroom you're trying to identify? Fall, winter. Winter, you probably won't find many, but they do exist. Summer, and then spring. The habitat, what is it growing on? Wood, soil? Is it growing on a tree limb? Is it growing on the floor? Where is it growing, right? And then the habit, is it growing along with others or is it growing alone, right? Is it growing in a fairy ring by itself? Which of these is it, right? And then the cap, what color, consistency, shape, and size is this cap? It's going to be great identifying factors. None of that really helps us. Then we're going to take a spore print, and that's going to be where we decapitate the mushroom, take the cap, well, literally decapitate the mushroom, take the cap and put it on a piece of foil. And then we take a glass and put that over that mushroom. We wait about 4 hours, and from there, you should see a pretty solid little spore print under that cap once you take away that mushroom cap. And that's in the shape of the mushroom spores. It drops just like a fingerprint would if we were to put fingerprint with ink on a piece of paper. So just like a fingerprint, each mushroom has a unique fingerprint or spore print, and that allows us to somewhat identify them. Also, bruising and staining. Certain mushrooms bruised colors like blue or pink or black or yellow or green or oozing white latex, or who knows, there's literally every color, shape, size of thing that exists in mushroom form. But what color does it bruise when it's harmed, or does it not bruise? And then the smell. Some things smell. Mushrooms smell weird. Some smell like almonds, some smell like mushrooms, some smell like nothing, some smell like fish, like literal fish. It's disgusting. Pink oysters, for example, smell like fish. Ugh, hate them. Gold oysters smell like fish. Also hate them. But don't be biased. They're pretty good. I've just had bad experiences where I've grown too many of them at once. But yeah, so the smell is going to be a big indicator. So keep an eye out for that. Next, I like to go through some common mushrooms in the USA. These are not just exclusively found in Colorado, but a lot of these are found in Colorado. So the morel is one that is often found in Colorado. It's one of the most sought after mushrooms. It's extremely expensive. It can be pretty tricky to spot because it looks very similar to an acorn or a pine cone. That's what those things are called. They do have lookalikes, so make sure to correctly identify them. The lookalikes are going to be things that look like morels, but more brain-like and gross. And the lookalikes won't be hollow. They're going to be dense on the inside. Morels will be hollow, so always keep that in mind. And those are more the ones out here in Colorado. So everything that I'm talking about, double check, because your area might have some specific mushroom that grows out there that happens to either be edible and looks like our lookalike, or isn't our lookalike. It just gets complicated. So make sure you get a local field guide. Chanterelles are another one. They smell like fresh apricots when picked. Fall chanterelles do exist. So a good indicator is that gill to stem ratio and whether or not exists. Lots of orange mushrooms do exist, like the jack-o'-lantern mushroom, which is an orange glow-in-the-dark mushroom. Very tasty mushroom. The chanterelle is not the jack-o'-lantern. That's toxic. Chicken of the woods, that is an orange mushroom. Speaking of, very easy mushroom to spot. So when you see mushrooms like chicken of the woods, you can be pretty confident it's chicken of the woods, and it's not gonna, kill you. Speaking of killing you, only 1% of mushrooms are generally considered poisonous, and of those 1%, only 1 to 5% of those are considered fatal incidents. So you should worry about plants more. They don't have a whole lot of lookalikes. Yeah, sorry guys. I talk a lot of trash about plants. I can't lie. I'm a mushroom guy. I'm team mushroom. I think plants are cool, but I just think mushrooms are cooler. But I think that they work together, so you can't really love one or the other. But if I had to choose, we all know team mushroom. Chicken of the woods does taste a little bit like chicken, so hence the name. People say everything tastes like chicken, though, so don't believe it. People told me that alligator tastes like chicken, for example. Alligator does not taste like chicken. It tastes like a fish that was feathered, right? Not good. And obviously I probably had some horrible alligator, given that it was from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and the nearest gator is who knows where. So probably should try that again. But they do grow on dead and dying trees, and they're going to grow from the inside of those trees. So they're called heart rot fungi. Another one's the giant puffball. It's literally a giant puffball. So these are the size of soccer balls or bigger. I mean, they get gigantic, and these are edible. So when you cut them in half, they should be white and firm on the inside. If they're yellow, they're toxic. If they're white and firm, they're good to go. And also, they can get larger than a soccer ball. So I mentioned that to begin with. Sorry, guys. But, they can get really big. It's really fun. So you can pick these things and, if you're gentle about it, don't hurt the mycelium, there's nothing to worry about when it comes to the fruiting body. When you pick a mushroom, you're spreading its spores, so it's a good thing. Anyone that tells you otherwise is generally wrong, or they're talking about sclerosias, which people collect by digging up the mycelium, breaking up that network, collecting these little egg type things. That's kind of bad for the mycelium. That can happen in certain countries like China. There is one species called Polyporus umbellus that I'm working with and trying to learn how to grow, trying to pioneer a method how to grow, because it's endangered. And that's because people collect the sclerotia. So if I can figure out that method, I'll make it less endangered, which is a good thing. Lion's mane, another interesting one. Delicious mushroom with the texture of a crab. It kind of peels away just like a crab does. So very interesting. Looks like a white's lion's mane, so that's kind of where its name comes from. And it's very easy to identify due to that. It's got pretty interesting properties in terms of nerve regeneration and promoting neurogenesis. It's one of the few substances that have been shown to do it. It basically promotes and increases your NGF and NGH, which is your nerve growth factor and nerve growth hormone. And these things increase our nerve growth in themselves, in both repairing and creating new nerves. So mushrooms are incredible in their medicinal properties, and I am a walking, living testament to that. You can't see me walk, but I promise I can. And if I ever see you in person, just say hi. But the king bolete is one of our famous mushrooms out of Colorado. It's a huge mushroom. It's a polypore mushroom, which means the underside doesn't have gills, doesn't have those little tiny rows of gills. It has these pores instead. And these pores have spores inside of them that they shoot out. They have yellow pores here in Colorado, and it doesn't bruise blue when cut here in Colorado. So good indicator, and it has lots of lookalikes. So be cognizant of that. Now into the fun stuff, how to grow these mushrooms that we've been talking about for so long. Now, the process to grow mushrooms is pretty complicated. And so we break it down to 2 beginner-friendly techniques. Now, these aren't going to be from spore to mushroom, but they're going to be from, a certain point to a certain end fruiting stage. And so we've got 2 beginner-friendly techniques. One is to obtain a fruiting block online or from a local source. And so these fruiting blocks are blocks of hardwood fuel pellets and soybean hulls that have been sterilized and inoculated with grain spawn. What that means is we put mycelium inside of a sterilized media, and that mycelium has grown out and made this block white. So that's what we see on this bottom image right here, bottom left. That white block is mycelium. So from that mycelium block, we grow our mushrooms. Our other option is to do the mushroom bucket fruiting technique, where we buy spawn online, make our own substrate, and then pasteurize it and introduce that to a bucket where we grow our mushrooms. So the fruiting technique. So obtain your fruiting block. You can generally get these from a few different sources. So places like North Spore are great, maincapandstem.com. You can get them from Mossy Creek. I recommend North Spore, though. North Spore is a very reliable and known company, North Spore. So yeah, that's where I recommend getting them from. But you obtain the fruiting block, choose your species. Generally, oysters are easiest to grow, with lion's mane being a very close second. And then you're just going to simply cut the bag open. You're going to do a little 3-inch X cut right along the center of the block, just like we did here. And you can see those mushrooms grow out of that 3-inch X cut. You place the block somewhere where it gets plenty of fresh air and some light, because remember, mushrooms breathe air. And we keep it humid via misting it a couple times per day. And we just mist it right where we cut it open, leave it somewhere where it gets fresh air, wait for the babies to show up in about a week, and the mushrooms will grow fully within about 3 to 5 days. So it's pretty much as easy as that. The hard part is building the mycelial block. And so I offer an advanced class that's more of the how do you build the mycelium blocks themselves and less how do you grow the mushrooms. Because as you can see, the hard part's not growing the mushrooms, it's growing the mycelium because it has to be done in lab settings with aseptic fruiting techniques and stuff like that, or aseptic culturing techniques. Alternatively, you can grow a mushroom, you can build a mushroom fruiting tent, and that can grow the mushrooms for you. Next, the mushroom grow bucket. You're going to need things like 2 plastic buckets, 1 drill, a mushroom grain spawn bag, some boiling water, straw, hardwood sawdust or hardwood fuel pellets, and then micropore tape. We'll get all of those, and essentially what we do is we take our hardwood fuel pellets, that's what I like to start with. We add about 1 pound of substrate to 1.5 pounds of boiling water. So we'll take our substrate, pour it into there. So pour our hardwood fuel pellets into the bottom 1 bucket, pour our water in there at the correct ratio. Then we're going to seal that bucket and we're going to let that sit for about 12 hours. And after it's sat for about 12 hours, we're going to go ahead and in the meantime, take the other bucket and drill 1/4 inch diameter holes. The spacing is going to be 2 to 3 inches apart. You could actually do them 4 to 6 apart if you want to get a little bit denser mushroom clusters. So 4 to 6 is a little better actually. All throughout the bucket, top to bottom, like they have here. And then you're going to go ahead and take that substrate that you've allowed to chill for 12 hours. You're going to take a layer of that and put that on the bottom of the bucket. Now, in the meantime of all of this, you'll have ordered grain spawn online. Again, you can buy them from North Spore or other reputable sources. Do some digging online and you'll find them. But grain spawn is like the seeds or the colonization agent that we add to our substrate to propagate it out. So we add a layer of this substrate that we've made ourselves and pasteurized. And then we add a layer of the grain spawn. Then we add a layer of our substrate. Then we add a layer of our grain spawn. We do that all the way to the top until we've reached a point where we just add our substrate to the very tippy top and pat it down. And then we add our bucket lid and duct tape all of the holes closed. About 2 weeks later, we take all of the tape off and replace that tape with micropore tape. And we start to spray the holes. From there, we're going to take off a few of the micropore tapes and leave them completely exposed. And that's where the mushrooms are going to grow from. In about 2 to 4 weeks, you're going to have mushrooms growing and you should be able to regrow them. In both techniques, you're able to reflush. All you have to do is cut a new hole in your bag, cover the other one with a piece of tape and care for that one. Or with this bucket technique, simply take off new holes, put the tape on the holes that you harvested from and start spraying the new holes. And that's pretty much all that you have to do to grow mushrooms with the fruiting block or the bucket tech. Now, I don't know if anyone has any questions. I usually like to save them till the end here. Please either post them in chat, that totally works for me, or go ahead and turn your microphones on.
I'll go ahead and start us off, Isaiah. That was amazing. I really appreciate your personal story and all that information that you have. At least 3 questions came in earlier, so we'll start with those. The first one from Paula: why are some mushrooms poisonous?
Yeah, so some of the mushrooms are poisonous because it's a defense mechanism. They don't want to get eaten until they're old enough to drop their spores. And they want to continue their life cycle essentially. So that's the main reason they're poisonous. Some mushrooms are poisonous because they're just not compatible with our bodies, right? And they're compatible with other organisms' bodies. Mushrooms have just evolved in different weird ways for different reasons, just like we have over a millennia, essentially. Hopefully that answered that guy.
Thank you. Thank you. Paula, you can write back if you have any follow-up questions. Here's one that was: I understand decomposing, but what do mushrooms build up or create? Is that the humus that you were talking about before?
Yeah, so I mean, they're making humus, so they're making the topsoil, but they're also actually growing the plants themselves. So they're raising the plants to full maturity. So if the mushrooms didn't exist, these mycorrhizal mushrooms, we wouldn't be able to have the ecosystems we have. We're able to grow plants in sterile conditions because we add fertilizers, which are kind of like fast foods for plants. But that's also why we're seeing plants fail in such large numbers, because there are no fungal partners anymore to protect them from blights and things like that. So that's why the Cavendish banana, for example, is disappearing and dying. And it's all right. I don't like that banana very much anyways. There's much better versions of bananas. But yeah, so that's kind of what they produce, but they're going to also produce like medicinal compounds from the mushrooms themselves that we can use. They're going to produce mushrooms that we can eat. So they produce a lot of things and they break down a lot of things. They're just like Legos, essentially, putting things together and taking them apart.
Okay, thank you. I see Mike Cap has his hand up, and he had a pretty intensive question here, Mike. Was this a different question, or is it the one that you texted?
It's the same question. So I attempted to start a mushroom farm outdoors during the drought. We had a drought this year in New England, which was probably a bad time to try it. So I had a freshly fallen oak tree, and I bought the plugs, and I did like maybe 5 different varieties, shiitake, maitake, some common ones, and I plugged it. And then we had the drought, and I basically put water on the logs about every 2 or 3 days. I haven't seen anything yet come out, and I'm just wondering your opinion if you think that I might have a possibility of something coming out, or if maybe the drought was just a bad idea at the time to start a mushroom farm.
How long ago was it?
It was late summer that I started, that I actually did it.
Okay, yeah, I mean, usually minimum time is like sometimes a year.
Okay.
So you usually don't see them pop up till like at least a year, but it's usually closer to 2. So the only thing that could be an issue is if you did multiple species on the same log, they kind of compete with each other. Oh, you didn't? Okay, perfect.
Did not. But the logs are within fairly close proximity of each other with different species. They're just
That's
separate.
okay.
Okay.
Yeah, as long as they're separate.
Yeah. And they are laying down. I don't have them standing.
That's okay too. Yeah. Sometimes it's beneficial because they want to interact with the soil bacteria slightly to know that they've hit the ground.
Thank you.
Of course.
And I just want to follow up with that. You said it takes about a year minimum, and that's with the method that he's doing with the fallen logs, not the 2
Yes.
methods that you showed. Okay.
The 2 methods I show are closer to 2 to 4 weeks. And that's just because of the density of the wood. It's much denser, so they have a lot more to eat before they produce their mushrooms, because they only want to produce their mushrooms at the very end of their life or when they feel confident enough in their reproductive fitness or viability.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you all again for attending today, and like I said, listening to me babble on for a while. It's a lot of stuff, I know. So I really appreciate you guys listening to my story and listening to me teach you about mushrooms and just being interested in fungi, because I think fungi are going to be an integral part of the future, and it starts with people like you. So thank you guys so much.
There's definitely an interest in, I think, the psilocybin
Yeah,
and the use of mushrooms and for medicinal purposes. So I think we're going to be reading a lot more about it. I've sent out the invitation a few times, I think, now to unmute. If anybody has a question, whether you want to write it in chat or go ahead and speak up now. I'll throw another one out there because personally, I had someone come out to check our trees, and they said one thing to watch out for is if you see mushrooms around your trees, that could be a sign of a problem. Is that because they're decomposing something bad, or are there certain mushrooms to look for in that case?
Well, it's really going to depend on the type of mushroom. Some mushrooms are going to be beneficial. They're going to be compost making, and that's going to be a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
But some mushrooms, like that honey mushroom, for example, I talked about, that's going to be a bad mushroom. That's going to be a parasitic mushroom that's hunting trees and other life forms like that. It's parasitizing weak trees.
Right, you showed that one that was what did you say, a heart something, and it's actually eating away at the tree.
Yeah, chicken of the woods. It's a heart rot fungi. Yeah, it eats it from the inside out.
Yes, thank you. All right, so it all depends on the mushroom.
Yes.
Be more specific.
We've got 2 hands up.
Oh, we do. I think the staff person has a hand up.
Yeah, this isn't a question, but when you talked about morel mushrooms, I totally forgot when I was a kid in Michigan, in northern Michigan, it's like my grandmother's hometown. They had like the morel mushroom festival, and people would go around hunting for them. And there was like a person dressed up as a giant morel mushroom. There was like a parade. I didn't get it as a kid, but it was a very exciting time. So that just occurred to me, brought back some memories.
Yeah, they're rare mushrooms, so it's a big deal when you find them. And Mike,
Yep. One other question that just occurred to me, and could you confirm this, that something I had heard? I do get puffballs in my yard, but I was told that you should never eat mushrooms that grow out of your grass because you fertilize the grass and the mushrooms will consume the fertilizer and they'll be contaminated.
yeah, the fertilizer, it's going to depend on the type of fertilizer you're using. If it's like something organic, then it's okay because they're just eating organic nutrients. But if it's inorganics, it's not going to be great. And also, the issue with eating mushrooms that you collect in your lawn is that a lot of our lawns and a lot of our water and really everything in our air in cities is all polluted. So mushrooms accumulate heavy metals, they accumulate it's mainly heavy metals because they can break down the pollutants, but they'll still suck up the pollutants. They won't do it as bad as plants do because it's the same thing with plants. You don't want to harvest plants that grow, like if you had wild garlic growing in your yard, same situation. It bioaccumulates the same things. It sucks things up into its stem. Mainly, again, heavy metals. It's not going to be a ton, but just not like a habit that you want to make. Something that you do all the time. So I recommend going out to the woods or somewhere that's a little bit far from civilization and looking for your wild edible plants there, herbs there, and your mushrooms there.
Thank you.
Mhm. Any more questions? Well, thank you guys again. Truly is a pleasure to be able to present to you all, and it's been great. Thank you guys so much. And I really hope that you guys feel like you learned a little bit about mushrooms and like you're taking away just a little bit of information that is going to inspire you to continue learning about mushrooms because they are truly the most incredible organism on the planet. And I implore you to look into them yourselves and discover that yourself because it's a wonderful world when it comes to mushrooms, and I think it's just beginning. So we could be the future of science, me, you, and every other person. So it's incredible.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Isaiah and Kate, for bringing him to us all the way from Colorado. I echo here what someone wrote. If you were looking in the comments, this is not what I expected the presentation to be. It was much better. So I do thank you so much for your passion and your knowledge and everything you shared with us. I did have a question here about getting the recording and the presentation. The recording will not be sent out. I am hoping against hope that technology is on our side and the recording is successful. We'll be posting that to our YouTube page at the library, and I will make sure that I get that all tested and set up so that I can send you a link if that is all correct. And I'll send that along with the feedback form. So you'll have an opportunity to watch this and share the news. All right. Thank you so much, Isaiah and Kate, and for everybody who joined us tonight. Good night,
Thank you
everyone.
so much. Have a
Thank
good
you guys
evening,
so much.
everyone.
Appreciate you all.
Thank you.
Nice job, Isaiah.
Thanks, Kate. Appreciate you. All right, bye, guys.
Bye-bye now.